You ever notice how the loudest rooms go silent when the wrong man sits in the right chair? The mess hall at Fort Braddock was built to hold 200 soldiers, all steel tables bolted to the floor, trays clattering, boots scraping, voices bouncing off concrete like restless echoes. But that afternoon, one table sat untouched, a clean rectangle in a sea of movement, marked with a small brass sign that read "Reserved for Command Guests." And in that chair, straight-backed but unassuming, sat Walter Hayes, 84 years old, 6 feet, even once upon a time, now slightly stooped, wearing a faded olive jacket that had seen more seasons than most men in that room had birthdays, his hands steady as he lifted a chipped white mug, black coffee. No sugar, no hurry, just quiet, deliberate motion, like time didn't apply to him the same way it did to everyone else. And people noticed, not because he made a scene, but because he didn't. Soldiers walked in, glanced at the table, then at each other, subtle nods, quiet detours, chairs dragged away from that space like it carried a weight no one wanted to test. A few whispers slipped between bites of reheated eggs and toast. Who's the old guy? Some retired officer? No ribbons, no escort, doesn't belong. But Walter didn't react, didn't look up, didn't claim the seat or defend it. He just sat there, as if he had been sitting in rooms like this long before any of them knew what a uniform meant. His eyes pale blue, fixed somewhere past the far wall, not distracted, not lost, just distant, like he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. A low hum beneath the noise, maybe memory, maybe habit, maybe something older than both. The overhead lights flickered once, a faint buzz, trays slid, laughter rose and fell. But that table stayed untouched, a quiet island in a storm of motion, and Walter Hayes remained exactly where he was, alone, uninvited, unchallenged, and somehow, unmistakably not out of place. The door at the far end of the mess hall opened with a sharp metallic click that cut clean through the low hum of conversation, and for a brief second no one turned, because doors opened all the time on a base like this, but something in the rhythm of the footsteps that followed made heads lift one by one, boots striking the polished concrete in measured, confident steps, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of walk that carried authority without needing to announce it. Corporal Ryan Maddox entered with 2 other soldiers trailing just behind him, his uniform crisp, his posture squared like he had just stepped out of a recruiting poster. He scanned the room, automatically checking faces, tables, spacing, until his eyes landed on the one place that broke the pattern, the reserved table, the untouched chair, the old man, still sitting there exactly as before, unmoved by the passing of time or the shifting of attention. Ryan slowed his pace, his jaw tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in irritation, because in his world things had order and meaning, and that table meant something. It represented rank, recognition, earned presence, and the man sitting there did not fit any of those categories, at least not in any way Ryan understood. He changed direction mid-stride, his boots angling toward the isolated table each step, drawing a few more glances from nearby soldiers who sensed what was about to happen. Conversations thinned, forks paused halfway to mouths, a chair leg scraped softly as someone leaned back to get a better view. Ryan stopped at the edge of the table, casting a shadow across the metal surface. Walter Hayes did not look up immediately. He took another slow sip of his coffee, set the mug down with a quiet, deliberate motion, and only then lifted his eyes, meeting Ryan's gaze without tension, without challenge, just a steady calm that felt out of place in a room built on hierarchy. Ryan placed his tray down with a firm, controlled motion, the sound louder than it needed to be. "Sir, this table is reserved for command guests," he said, his voice even but edged with something sharper underneath, the kind of authority practiced in front of a mirror. Walter's eyes flicked briefly to the small brass sign, then back to Ryan. "So I noticed," he replied, his tone low, gravelly, carrying the weight of years without raising in volume. A few soldiers nearby exchanged glances. Ryan exhaled slowly, as if resetting his patience. "I am going to need you to move to another table," he continued, this time a little louder, making sure others could hear, reinforcing the line between who belonged and who did not. Walter's gaze did not waver. "I have sat in rooms like this longer than you have been alive, son," he said, not as a challenge, not as a boast, just a simple statement laid down like a fact that did not need approval. A ripple moved through the room, not laughter, not yet, but something close to it. Ryan's lips pressed Into a thin line, he reached down toward the edge of Walter's jacket where something worn and faded peeked from the pocket, a small cloth patch, edges frayed, colors nearly erased by time. "And what exactly makes you think that matters here?" Ryan said as his fingers brushed the fabric, beginning to pull it free. The fabric came free with a soft pull, lighter than it should have been, like it had already let go of most of its past. And Ryan held it up between two fingers, squinting at the faded threads, as if trying to force meaning out of something that refused to explain itself. The patch barely held its shape, the edges worn smooth, the colors drained to ghost tones of gray and dull green, and at its center, almost erased by time, the outline of a broken-winged bird still clung to existence above a line of text that had nearly disappeared. "Raven Ridge," Ryan read aloud, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from the surrounding tables. A few soldiers leaned in, others paused mid-bite, the room tightening around the moment. "Never heard of it," he added with a short breath of disbelief, turning the patch slightly as if a different angle might reveal something impressive, but it did not. It looked like nothing, and that was the problem. Walter's eyes followed the movement slowly, not the way a man watches something valuable being taken, but the way someone watches a memory being handled by hands that do not understand it. There was no anger there, no urgency, just a quiet stillness that seemed to settle heavier with each passing second. "You would not," Walter said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the hum of the overhead lights. But it landed anyway, precise and final. Ryan let out a small laugh, not loud, not cruel, just confident, the kind that comes from believing you are on solid ground. "Then it does not mean much around here, does it?" he replied, letting the patch hang loosely from his fingers, and somewhere to the left a chair shifted, a subtle scrape that did not belong to the rhythm of the room. Emily Brooks stood near the service counter, a tray still in her hands, her eyes fixed on the patch, not with confusion, but with recognition that had not fully formed yet, like a word on the tip of the tongue. She had seen that shape before, not the patch itself, but something close, a symbol half remembered from a framed photograph down the hall outside the command offices. A group of men standing shoulder to shoulder in faded black and white, a caption beneath it that most people walked past without reading. Her grip tightened slightly on the tray as she watched Ryan lower the patch closer to the table, as if he might drop it or set it aside. Like it was nothing, Walter's gaze did not follow the patch anymore. It lifted instead, just slightly, past Ryan, past the rows of tables, towards something unseen, and for a brief moment the room seemed to dim around him, not in light, but in presence, like everything else had stepped back. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, steady, unmoving, and when he spoke again it was softer, but it carried further. "It meant enough once," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no defense, just a statement that did not ask to be believed, and that unsettled something in the air. Ryan felt it without naming it, a flicker of uncertainty that passed as quickly as it came. He straightened slightly, rolling his shoulders back, recentering himself in the moment. "Well, things change," he said, placing the patch down on the table with a light tap that echoed louder than expected. And across the room, Emily set her tray down carefully, her eyes never leaving Walter Hayes as she took a step back, already reaching for the phone tucked beneath the counter, because something about that name, that patch, that quiet way he sat there, told her this was not going to stay a small moment for long. Emily's fingers moved faster than her thoughts as she stepped behind the counter, the low murmur of the mess hall fading into a dull background hum, while she scrolled through a contact list she rarely used, her heartbeat steady but her instincts sharp, because something about the name Raven Ridge would not let go. It tugged at a memory not fully hers, something she had only seen in passing, a plaque, a hallway, a story no one told out loud anymore. And when the line connected, she did not hesitate. "Master Sergeant Pierce, this is Emily in the mess hall. I think you need to come down here," her voice low, controlled, careful not to draw attention. On the other end there was a pause, then a clipped response asking for a reason. She glanced back toward the table, toward the old man still sitting exactly as he had been, unmoved, unshaken, while Corporal Maddox stood over him, trying to hold on to authority that felt just slightly out of reach now. "There is a man here, older, sitting at the command table. He has a patch. It says Raven Ridge," she said, And for a brief second there was nothing but silence on the line. Not static, not confusion, just silence that carried weight. Then the voice returned, slower this time, sharper. Say that again. Emily swallowed lightly. Eyes still locked on Walter Hayes' Raven Ridge, she repeated. And this time the silence stretched longer before a single word came back. Quiet, but urgent, stay there. The line clicked dead, across the room. Ryan Maddox shifted his stance. Unaware of the shift already in motion beyond his reach, he tapped the patch again with one finger, as if emphasizing his point. Look, I do not know what you think this is, but this is not how things work anymore, he said, his voice steady but missing the certainty it held moments ago. Walter did not respond right away, his gaze drifting briefly to the patch now resting on the cold metal table between them. Then back to Ryan. Things work the same, he said. Softly. People just forget. The words landed differently this time, not as a challenge, but as something heavier, something that did not need agreement to be true. A few soldiers nearby exchanged uneasy looks, the energy in the room shifting from casual curiosity to something more restrained, more watchful, as if they were all waiting for a piece of information they did not yet have. Ryan felt it, the subtle change, the way the room no longer backed him the same way, and he straightened slightly, reinforcing his posture. Well, around here we follow current command, not old stories, he replied, placing his hand flat on the table near the patch, drawing a clear line, but Walter's eyes did not drop to the hand, did not acknowledge the gesture. They remained steady, patient, like a man who had already seen how this moment would end. And somewhere beyond the double doors at the far end of the hall, footsteps began to echo again, faster this time, more urgent, cutting through the building like a signal that had finally reached its destination. The sound of approaching boots did not rush. It carried, deliberate and unmistakable, cutting through the mess hall like a signal no one had been waiting for, but everyone felt. Conversations thinned to murmurs, then to nothing. Trays hovered midair, eyes shifted toward the double doors as they pushed open with controlled force, and Master Sergeant Nolan Pierce stepped inside, his presence quiet but immediate, the kind that did not need volume to command attention. His gaze moved once across the room and locked onto the table in the corner, onto the patch, onto the man sitting behind it. And something in his expression changed, not confusion, not curiosity, recognition, sharp and undeniable. He walked forward without hesitation, each step measured, each second stretching the tension tighter. Ryan Maddox noticed the shift too late, his posture stiffening as Pierce approached. Master Sergeant, Ryan began, straightening, voice snapping back into protocol. But Pierce did not stop, did not acknowledge him. Not yet, his focus fixed on Walter Hayes, who remained seated, unchanged, as if he had been expecting this exact moment. All along, Pierce reached the table and came to a full stop, standing just to the side, his eyes dropping briefly to the patch resting on the metal surface, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he looked back up at Walter. Sir, he said, the word landing heavier than rank, heavier than protocol. It carried something older, something earned, and that single word shifted the room more than any raised voice could have. Ryan blinked, caught off guard, his mind scrambling to realign the situation. Master Sergeant, this individual is seated in a restricted, Ryan started, but Pierce raised one hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop the sentence from continuing, his eyes finally turning to Ryan, calm but firm. Corporal, step back, he said, and there was no room in the tone for interpretation. Ryan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took a step back, the movement small but significant, the invisible line he had drawn moments ago dissolving under a command that outranked not just his authority, but his certainty. Pierce's attention returned to Walter, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with something the rest of the room could not fully understand, something that did not need explanation. Walter gave a slight nod, barely noticeable, but Pierce caught it, and that was enough. He reached down slowly, carefully, and picked up the worn patch from the table, holding it with both hands now, not as an object, but as something that carried weight, memory, history. His thumb brushed lightly over the faded stitching as if confirming what he already knew, and when he spoke again his voice was lower, steadier. Raven Ridge was Not in any official report, he said, not to Ryan, not to the room, but to the air itself, as if stating a fact that had been waiting too long to be acknowledged. A ripple moved through the soldiers watching, confusion mixing with something deeper, something like respect forming without full understanding. Ryan swallowed, his earlier confidence now replaced with something quieter, uncertain. Sir, with respect, I have never heard of that unit, he said, trying to regain footing. Pierce did not. Look at him this time, his eyes still on the patch. That is because you were not meant to, he replied. And across the room, Emily Brooks exhaled slowly, realizing that whatever was about to unfold had already begun long before anyone in that mess hall walked through those doors. The air in the mess hall shifted in a way that could not be measured but could be felt, like pressure before a storm, and every soldier in that room knew something had crossed an invisible line that could not be stepped back over. Master Sergeant Pierce still held the patch with both hands, his posture firm, but his expression no longer neutral. There was weight behind his eyes now, something personal, something remembered. And when he finally looked back at Walter Hayes, there was a quiet respect there that did not need to be spoken out loud. Walter met that look with the same calm he had carried from the beginning, unchanged, unshaken, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had seen this pattern unfold more than once across different rooms and different years. Pierce drew in a slow breath before speaking again, his voice low but clear enough to reach every corner of the hall. There were 5 of them, he said, not addressing anyone directly. Yet everyone listened. 5 names that never made it into any public record. 5 men sent where there were no cameras, no reports, no recognition. His thumb pressed lightly against the worn stitching of the patch. Raven Ridge was not a place you were assigned to. It was a place you did not come back from. The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just stated like fact, and that made them carry further. Ryan Maddox felt his chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from the slow realization that he had stepped into something far larger than he understood. His eyes moved from Pierce to Walter and back again, searching for a point of control that no longer existed. Sir, I did not mean, he began, but the words felt incomplete even as he spoke them. Pierce lifted a hand again, stopping the sentence before it could form into something hollow. You meant exactly what you said, Corporal, Pierce replied, his tone not harsh, but firm, grounded in truth rather than correction, and that made it land harder. Ryan's jaw tightened, his earlier confidence now reduced to silence. He took another small step back without being told, creating space he had not realized he needed. Pierce lowered his gaze to the patch once more, then carefully, almost ceremonially, placed it back on the table in front of Walter, not dropping it, not sliding it, but setting it down with intention, as if returning something to its rightful place. Walter's hand moved then, slow and steady, resting lightly over the patch, his fingers covering the faded bird as if shielding it from further misunderstanding. His eyes drifted past Pierce for a brief moment, toward the far wall again, and for the first time there was a flicker of something deeper there, not emotion in the way most would recognize it, but memory, distant and quiet, like a door opening somewhere far behind him. The room held its breath without realizing it. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the small sounds of the mess hall seemed to have faded away. And then, from somewhere beyond the doorway, another set of footsteps approached, different from before, heavier, slower, carrying a presence that made Pierce straighten slightly without turning around. And Walter Hayes, still seated, still calm, let out the faintest exhale, as if recognizing that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. The second set of footsteps did not echo loudly, but they carried a gravity that pressed into the room before the man even crossed the threshold. And when the doors opened again, this time no one ignored it. Every head turned at once, chairs straightened, backs aligned. The air itself seemed to tighten as Colonel Thomas Whitaker stepped inside, his uniform immaculate, his presence quiet but absolute. He did not rush, did not raise his voice, but the effect was immediate. Conversation ceased entirely, trays lowered, soldiers rose to their feet in instinctive response, a ripple of discipline moving outward from the doorway like a wave. Master Sergeant Pierce turned fully now, posture snapping into place, but the colonel did not acknowledge him yet. His eyes moved across the room once, scanning, searching, and then they found him. The man at the table, the one no one else had recognized until now. And something shifted in the colonel's expression. Not surprise, not confusion. Something deeper, something older, like a memory resurfacing after years of silence. He began walking forward, each step measured, deliberate, cutting a straight path through the center of the mess hall. Soldiers instinctively moved aside, creating space without being told, the distance between him and Walter Hayes shrinking with every second. Ryan Maddox stood frozen where he was, his earlier authority now completely dissolved, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The colonel was not heading to the command table out of routine. He was heading directly toward the old man. And that made no sense in the world Ryan understood. Pierce stepped aside slightly as the colonel approached, not out of formality, but out of recognition that this moment did not belong to him. Walter Hayes remained seated, unchanged, his hand still resting lightly over the worn patch, his gaze lifting slowly to meet the colonel's as he came to a stop beside the table. And for a brief moment the room held its breath again, the kind of silence that feels almost physical, pressing against every surface. The colonel looked down at Walter, his eyes steady, searching, confirming, and then he exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry years with it. His posture shifted, not into authority, but into something more personal, more grounded. He reached out and pulled the empty chair beside Walter away from the table, the metal legs scraping lightly against the floor. The sound sharpened the silence, and without hesitation, without announcement, he sat down next to him, not across, not above, but beside him, equal, present, and that single action sent a shock through the room stronger than any command could have. Ryan felt it like a physical jolt, his chest tightening as realization finally began to form. This was not protocol. This was not courtesy. This was something else entirely. Something earned long before Ryan had ever worn a uniform. The colonel leaned slightly toward Walter, his voice low but clear enough to carry across the stillness. "I told you I would find you," he said, and the words landed with quiet finality. Not a question, not a greeting, but a promise fulfilled. Walter's lips moved just slightly, the faintest hint of a nod following. And for the first time since he had entered the room, there was the smallest shift in his expression, not a smile, not relief, but something close to recognition, as if a long wait had finally come to its end. And around them, the entire mess hall stood in silence, witnessing a moment none of them had been prepared to understand. The silence did not break after the colonel spoke. It deepened, settling over the room like a weight no one dared disturb. And for a moment nothing moved except the faint rise and fall of breath across 200 soldiers standing perfectly still. Colonel Whitaker sat beside Walter Hayes with the ease of someone who had waited years for that exact chair, his posture no longer rigid with command, but grounded, present, human. His eyes remained on Walter, not searching now, but steady, certain. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet clarity that reached every corner of the mess hall without needing to rise. "They never put Raven Ridge in the records," he said, his tone measured, almost reflective. "But some of us never forgot." A subtle shift passed through the room, soldiers exchanging glances, not out of confusion anymore, but out of recognition that they were witnessing something far beyond protocol. Master Sergeant Pierce stood a step behind them, his shoulders squared, his expression firm, but there was a respect in the way he held his position, like a guardian standing watch over something important. Ryan Maddox remained where he was, but the space around him felt different now, heavier, his earlier certainty gone, replaced with a quiet realization that had not fully settled yet. His eyes moved between the colonel and the old man, trying to understand how the pieces fit together and why no one had told him this story. Walter's hand rested over the patch, his fingers still, his gaze forward, but there was a shift now, subtle, almost invisible, like a man allowing himself to be seen after years of choosing not to be. Colonel Whitaker reached toward the patch, not to take it, but to adjust it slightly where it lay on the table, aligning it with care, with intention, his fingers pausing for just a moment longer than necessary before he withdrew his hand. "You pulled me out when no one else could reach me," he said quietly, the words simple, unadorned, but carrying something far deeper than explanation, a memory shared between two men that needed no further detail. Walter did not answer right away. his eyes lowering briefly to the patch, then lifting again, meeting the colonel's gaze with the same steady calm. "You made it out," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper, but it carried, because the room was listening, truly listening now. Colonel Whitaker gave the slightest nod, the kind that acknowledged more than survival, more than time. It acknowledged debt, respect, something that could not be measured in rank or years, and slowly, without being told, the soldiers in the mess hall straightened further, some bringing their hands to their sides, others simply standing taller, as if an unspoken understanding had moved through them all at once. Ryan swallowed, his throat dry, his earlier words echoing back in his mind with a weight he had not expected, and for the first time since he had stepped into that space, he did not try to speak, did not try to correct or reclaim. He simply stood, watching, learning, and at the center of it all, Walter Hayes remained seated, calm, quiet, exactly as he had been from the beginning. But now the room had changed around him, and everyone could finally see what had been there all along. No one spoke after that, not because they were told to be quiet, but because there was nothing left to interrupt, the kind of silence that does not come from discipline but from understanding, slow and steady, settling into every corner of the room. Colonel Whitaker remained seated beside Walter Hayes, not in command, not above him, just present, as if rank had stepped aside for something older, something that did not need insignia to be recognized. Walter's hand still rested over the patch, the worn fabric now no longer overlooked, no longer questioned, just seen, truly seen, and for a long moment neither man moved, the weight of years sitting between them without tension, without urgency, just quiet acknowledgement. Then Walter reached for his coffee again, lifting the mug with the same steady hand he had used from the beginning, taking a slow sip as if the room had not changed at all, as if this moment was simply another breath in a much longer story. Colonel Whitaker watched him for a second longer before shifting slightly in his chair, turning just enough to face the room. His voice did not rise, but it carried, firm and clear. "Stand easy," he said. And the words broke the stillness not with force, but with permission. The soldiers lowered their shoulders, breaths released, but no one returned to normal, not fully. Something had shifted too deeply for that. Master Sergeant Pierce remained where he was, his posture easing but his eyes still sharp. Ryan Maddox finally moved, one step forward, then another, slower this time, measured, uncertain. He stopped at the edge of the table, not towering over it now, but approaching it with a different weight. His eyes dropped briefly to the patch, then lifted to Walter, and for the first time since he had spoken, there was no edge in his voice, no performance, just honesty. "Sir, I did not know," he said, the words simple, but real. Walter looked at him then, really looked at him, not as a challenge, not as a judgment, but as a man looking at another who was still learning. His expression did not soften, but it did not harden either. It remained what it had always been, steady, grounded, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to close the distance that had existed minutes before. Ryan stepped back again, this time not out of command, but out of respect, and the room held that moment quietly. No applause, no reaction, just a shared understanding that something important had just taken place. Colonel Whitaker reached toward the table once more, tapping the edge lightly with 2 fingers, not to draw attention, but as a subtle signal. And then he stood, not abruptly, but with intention, turning to Walter for a brief second, their eyes meeting one last time. No words exchanged.